because this is a conference on power, I'm going to use the next little while to try and convince you that creatives, like the people in this room, but broadly, are inadvertently and counterproductively handing power over to, and I was going to describe them differently, but Rory, who always helps reframe things, handing power over to the fuckers we have to deal with every day. And you don't need to, but if you're going to change that, you're going to have to stop being on defense and go on the offense. This is a quote from George Washington, actually, the general of the U.S. Army during the War of Independence. And I believe that's what we need to do. And I will explain why and hopefully how in this short talk. So I'm going to start with a creative activity. My world is the world of strategy. I've been doing it for many, many years. It's a creative activity. And what is it? This is the definition I use for strategy, which probably many branders, marketers in the room would say rings true to them. Strategy is an integrative set of choices that compels desired customer action, and that is a creative act. Right? And why is it so important that it compels desired customer action? Because in a company controls a whole lot of stuff. Companies have control over lots and lots of stuff. How many employees, how many square feet of office, and how many factories, how much they're going to spend on advertising. All of those things are totally in control of the company. Right? What's the one super important thing they don't control? Customers. Right? Whether or not customers pull cash out of their pocket and give it to you rather than somebody else. So strategy is this creative act of creating a set of choices that all work together to compel customers to do what you'd like them to do. Now, I wish that was the practice of strategy out in the world, but it isn't. So 95% of what is called strategy and has strategy on its label, like strategic planning, is actually a thing called planning. And planning involves making up a list of all laudable and doable initiatives that are in the areas under our control, right? Versus strategy. The list on the left is not creative at all, right? How do people decide what to put on the list and what not to put on the list when they're supposedly doing the creative act of strategy, but doing something else, planning? And I swear, 95% of all things that are called strategy are to the left. They have nothing actually to do with strategy. Well, it's to use data. It's to crunch data, right, in order to make your decisions. In fact, every business school on the planet teaches you that the only good decision is a decision rigorously made on the basis of data. So you go crunch the data, figure out what the regression line is, what the R-squared is, and on the basis of that, you make your decisions. And that is become dominant in the world of business. Would we agree? That is the way you're supposed to make decisions, right? And that has created a self-sealing system, right? So it's the dominant in the world. So analysis is encouraged in business. Business becomes friendly to technocrats, right, who can do analysis till the cows come home because it doesn't require any creativity. And business education, as I said, is geared to technocrats. MBA programs are designed to teach technocrats to become more technocratic, which makes business as a whole more friendly to technocrats. The strategy firms who hire the people from the business schools, they embrace planning because there's lots of money to be made in planning. Putting together long lists of initiatives is good business. You don't actually have to be any good or smart. You just have to be thorough in putting together lists, so it's awesome, and it makes business even more friendly to that. So we have a self-sealing system that says you simply analyze data, right, in order to make your decisions, right? Now, here's the slight problem with that. So if you think about a fundamental challenge to data, right? If we ask data and the time dimension and ask the fundamental question, if this line is now, where does data come from? Most of it? A lot of it? All of it. As of the time you perform the analysis, every piece of data that you could possibly use is from the past, or what would it be called? Not data, right? Simple as that. Okay, so this is just kind of true. We've got no dispute that all the data of the world comes from one single era called the past. Now, these analytical methodologies we use kind of are rooted in statistics, and every business school on the face of the planet teaches the fundamentals of statistical inference. And so you're taught, if you have a thing called a universe that you're trying to understand, how do you understand that universe? You derive a sample from that. And what characteristic does the sample have to have? What characteristic? Anybody? Exactly. Well, you guys know your stuff. It's got to be representative, right? Right? Otherwise, what if we want to know what people want in EVs and we only interview men, or only interview women, or only interview young people, or only interview old people, or only interview people on the East Coast? We would get told by the statistician, that's bad. You can't do that because you have no idea. All you'll know is that your analysis will be flawed, and you won't know what direction it will be flawed in, right? We've all been taught that. So that if you have a representative sample, it's fair, correct, and right for you to make an inference about the universe. Now, with delusional techies, they'll say to me, oh, Roger, this is no longer relevant because in the new world of technology, you don't have to sample, you can use the entire universe, so what you say doesn't make any sense. They're silly and wrong. The same thing holds whether you're having a small sample, a medium-sized sample, a large sample, or a super large sample. So if your sample has to be representative, right? And if all data is from the past, what does that say that your fundamental inadvertent assumption is about the world? Think about it for a minute, right? That is what the analytical methods you've been taught have as a fundamental hidden, they don't teach you this, but this fundamental hidden assumption. Because if the future is different than the past, and you've used a sample from the past, is your sample representative? No. And your statistics teacher, professor, would tell you, don't make any inferences from that data because it's not representative, and you'll make terrible, terrible mistakes, right? If the future is identical to the past, right, this is perfect. That sample was representative. Just happens to be from the past, but the future is the same anyway, so sample's a sample, you're good. So far, so good? Okay. So the original data analytics guy was a guy named Aristotle. We heard about Socrates before. Aristotle. He's the first person in the world who essentially decided, I want to be rigorous about trying to figure out what is the cause of the effects we see. And he essentially invented science. He says, well, you go out and observe enough data, essentially, to be able to understand what's the cause of the effects we see This is a book, Analytica Posterior, the most important book ever written on science. So he wrote that 2,500 years ago. Then we went into the Dark Ages and things got messy, and we came out of it and had a scientific revolution, and the scientific method is attributed to Bacon, Newton, Descartes, Galileo, but this is the original, this is the OG of data analytics. But he made a distinction. He said science, his methodology, is for what he called the part of the world where things cannot be other than they are. Okay? Now, what did Aristotle mean by that? If I let go of this, what is going to happen? It falls to the ground. Last week? 100 years ago? Next week? 100 years from now? 1,000 years from now? It's going to fall. That is what he would characterize as the part of the world where things cannot be other than they are. And there's a bunch of the world that is that way. Gravity doesn't come and go. Right? The boiling point of water doesn't come and go. There's a bunch of things that don't come and go. They're part of the world where things cannot be other than they are. And why would he say, use my scientific method in that part of the world? Right? Because your sample is representative. So you can make predictions about the future. I predict that tomorrow, if I let go of one of these things, it'll fall. And that's a good prediction. It's a sound prediction. You should be making that prediction. And in fact, if you can figure out that force of gravity and it accelerates things everywhere in the world except one place, accelerates them at 9.8 meters per second squared, right? Other than the United States, it accelerates at 32 feet per second squared because the United States is exceptional. So in that part of the world, science is awesome and science advances the world. We should be worshiping science the way we do worship science because it is so important. Knowing these things is better than not knowing them. So says the world's first and greatest scientist. But he said something, and this is taught in every history of science course, humanity, this is taught. He said something else that's conveniently untaught almost anywhere in the world. He issued a warning. He said, there's another part of the world. There's a part of the world where things can be other than they are. What part of the world would that be? Well, how many of these things, smartphones, were there in 1999? Anybody know the answer? How many? 0. Because the BlackBerry, the first one, was in 2000. How many are there now? Last time I looked at the numbers, it was 5.5 billion of them. To me, that's indicative of a part of the world where things can be other than they are. And it turns out kind of that the part of the world where things can be other than they are is like every part of the world where human beings interact with one another and kind of do things together, like kind of business, for example. Like, that's that part of the world. And again, the guy who invented science didn't say, now be careful, you have to sample a little bit differently, or he said, do not use my scientific method. What has the world decided to do? Use it for every friggin' thing in the world. Science has overtaken every discipline. And it's sure as hell taken over my discipline of business. What did he say that you should do? He didn't just say, don't do it. He said, this is what you should do. This is the rigorous thinking method that's as rigorous as a scientific method. You should imagine possibilities and choose the one for which the most compelling argument can be made. And he called this Rhetoric. He has a book written on rhetoric that's probably read in 10 courses on the face of the planet. Right? It's completely lost in the world. But notice he said the most compelling argument. So he said what we should do in this world, in this part of the world, is we should all come forward with our possibilities and put forward our best argument for why this would be a good way of going into the future, creating something new that changes that part of the world that is changeable in a way we would like, and may the best argument win. Not may the most powerful data win, but the best argument needs to win. So my view is that for innovation in modern business, there's a few things that we should keep in mind. One is all revenue forecasting is a fantasy. So there are, I would argue, billions of person-hours spent a year forecasting revenues. Would you not agree? You spend, how many hundreds of hours does each one of you spend on revenue? Hey, boss comes and says, we need a forecast for what we're going to do next quarter, right? It's useless. Zero utility. One of the biggest wastes we heard talk about, wasted things, friction we can get rid of, if we just stopped revenue forecasting entirely. Because what are we trying to do? Compel action that we don't control, and we're somehow going to put numbers on a page that sort of say, because we say so, we say our revenues are going to be this, that has some relation to what those will actually be? There is no correlation. So that's a waste. But I would argue my second takeaway from this is I've come to believe it's impossible to defend innovation in modern business. In modern business, what happens? What were they, Rory? The fuckers we have to deal with every day will say, here's my data, right, that says this is what we're going to do, what we should do. You come up with a creative idea per Aristotle. You obey Aristotle entirely. You come up with possibilities. You choose the one for which you think the most compelling argument can be made, and then you're told what? Yeah, show me the data. Show me the revenue forecast for that, right? And we play by their rules. We go out and do some analysis, right, which demonstrates what? That it isn't going to work because we're suggesting doing something that isn't being done now, doing something differently, and the data can only show you sameness. That's all it can ever show you. Right? So they send us on this errand, and I would argue that the people in this room, me included, for decades, would dutifully go off and try and do the analysis to get our innovation accepted. Am I correct? Right? That's playing defense on their playing field. It's a deeply, deeply, deeply flawed playing field. I cannot overemphasize how flawed it is, right? We use a methodology that requires a representative sample, right? And then assume the future is the same as the past. You got to be kidding me. But we go and play on that field. I believe that the only thing that's going to be a breakthrough for innovation generally in the world and is going to give power back to the people who are most important. And those are the ones who invent the future. They're the ones we laud retrospectively. We laud all the things they did retrospectively after they're massively successful and forget the fact they didn't use the dominant methodology in use today to get to those answers. So it's go on the offense. When they say to you, I just need more data to support that idea, you need to say to them, where is your data about the future that supports the status quo? Right? You just got to ask them. Just reject what they want you to do and what they've practiced getting you to do, which is go on defense and go on offense against them. And just be relentless. Just say, no, so let me get this straight. Here's all your data, and you're assuming, am I correct here? You're assuming that the future is identical to the past, and that's why you think your revenue forecasts are really solid. We really know that it's solid because it used to do this, so it'll continue to do this. Is that what you're saying with your analysis? If they say, no, we've put in nuances to this, and just show me. And how exactly did you do that? And, what is actually the logic behind you forecasting something that you have no control over? Offense, offense, offense. Until they understand, right, that you're all in the same boat, and that your arguments about creating a future that does not now exist are more powerful than their stupid-ass misuse of statistical methods and ignoring the advice of the guy who created the methods you're using. So go on the offensive and never try to defend the indefensible. And you cannot ever convince somebody for creativity on their playing field. You will lose 100% of the time. Thank you.
Joy. I think you can see why I send out so many emails going, Roger is a god.
I don't think so.
I mean, there is...
But I am controversial.
There's, by the way, a fantastic story you'll love, since you mentioned the smartphone. We had an anthropologist on this stage about 10 years ago. And a bunch of management consultants had basically convinced Nokia that they could hold off on introducing smartphones for another 4 years.
Yeah,
because
no problem.
It would be another 4 or 5 years before they became affordable by the general population. She was working in a small part of China, and she said, what you've got to understand, in the very early days of the smartphone, people are spending insane amounts of money on these things.
Yes.
The reason being that a smartphone was not just a phone, it was their first access to the internet, it was their first computer, it was everything.
Everything, yeah.
And the response was, you've only got one data point, we've got thousands.
Yes.
Okay?
Yeah.
And they decided, on the advice of their management consultants, basically to sit on their hands for about 5 years. And of course, I suppose the rest is kind of history.
The rest is history.
Yeah.
But and it's a lovely story, and it is just classic of this schism where they say, that consultant said, all this data is more important than your insight, right?
Yeah.
Even though 100% of that data is from the past, and the last time I checked, the future is annoyingly different than the past, or blessedly, depending.
It's absurdly high burden of proof to demand that you can extract from the past data that will predict the future.
Right.
I mean, we work strangely quite a lot with police forces in behavioral science. And one of the interesting things about police work is they do separate the phase into two, which is there's the investigative phase, which is incredibly open-minded. You'll ask people, did you notice anything unusual on the evening of the 7th of November? Whatever. Eventually, you have to get to an evidential phase.
Right.
But you would never demand in a police investigation that the only information that can be collected is information with evidential value.
Yes.
Okay? Because generally the breakthrough in an investigation, I mean, I famously talk about this, the Yorkshire Ripper was partly caught because a cop noticed he'd parked the wrong way round in the Sheffield red light district.
Yes.
Okay? If you want to know the details, the convention was you park with your windscreen facing the wall because no one can see what's happening on the back seat. Handy etiquette tip there for all of you. Okay? He'd parked as if he wanted to make a quick getaway.
Yeah.
And now, that has no evidential value. You can't obviously imprison someone for 30 years for parking in a funny way.
Yes.
But it has investigative value, which is it tells you what to pursue further. So one of your great tips for creative strategy is which I think is an extraordinary definition of creativity, is the three things are: you resolve a trade-off, you spot an anomaly, or you use an analogy.
Yep. Yeah, those are the three things I found most useful, because people do ask the question, okay, Roger, Aristotle says, imagine possibilities. Where does that come from? I'm saying it does not come from deep data analytics, so where does it come from? And those are the three places that I've seen it. When somebody is faced with a trade-off, and they hate either A or B, right? But they like some things about A or B, but they hate them in totality. And so they are spurred to say, how could I somehow break that trade-off? I've seen that be the source of new ideas. I've seen analogies all the time. And this is basically how Silicon Valley works. Like, if you go for a pitch for money from VCs, if you don't have an analogy, this is like the Toms of this, or this is like the Uber of that, they turn you down. Basically, and so they look to analogies to come up.
The film industry is the same.
Yeah. Oh, right. No. Yeah. Exactly.
Alien was pitched as Jaws in space, which I think is rather
good. There you go.
Yeah.
There you go. But also anomalies, right?
Yeah.
Which is our entire scientific method drives your eyes. I mean, and this is an important part. Your eyes are driven to the mean mode median, right? That's where all your focus of your attention is, and it's driven away from the anomalies because what? They're anomalous, but maybe they're not. Maybe they say something about the future that if you paid attention to. And so the exercise I do is, what model of the world could I create that would make that anomaly on the regression line? What would the features of that world have to be for it? It would mean, oh, customers all need this thing, and there'd be a big giant distribution channel to get that to them, and companies. I imagine that world, and then ask myself the question, now that I've imagined it, could I bring that about? And so that's what I do with anomalies.
This is a great question, by the way. What would have to be true in order for this to happen?
Yes. That's hopefully the most useful thing I've ever come up with.
I mean, it may be unattainable, by the way. That's a fair acknowledgement, isn't it? That
yes,
you can. There is a parallel universe, but there's no way of getting there.
Yeah. And then you say that is an anomaly and will be an anomaly when we do the regression analysis 20 years from now. There'll be that, but that is never going to be the mean. But this is what the people who do, like Malcolm Gladwell, before he did The Tipping Point, the book or the New Yorker article that spurred him doing that was called Cool Hunting. And he, as he always does, he followed around these cool hunters who would look at what the kids in the street basketball courts were wearing and thought was cool, and fringe communities, because they were hunting for what's fringe now but will be mainstream 20 years from now.
Because he spotted the fact that these things start small, and therefore they start anecdotal before they actually reach the level of data. There is a question here about trend spotting. Can we use Bayesian models, etc., to actually spot trends? I'm intrigued. There is some sort of statistical, if there are any real mathmos in here, there is some statistical method where you can use, I think it's Simpson's paradox, to spot anomalies within data, which are therefore possibly useful.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some sense we're all Bayesian updaters. Like, I think it's naturally born, but we will sometimes suppress it and say, well, that we're veering away from what I think is the way things are. And so I would say, in some sense, be entirely open to the idea that your Bayesian updating is kind of getting you in another direction, and keep on asking the question whether, even though, like let's say you think the world is working this way, you see something, you do your Bayesian updating and saying, well, the mean was 50 and it's now 50.1. You should ask yourself the question, well, how fast would it have to take for the mean to get to whatever 80? How many more of these data points would there have to be? And start kind of watching for that and saying, this may be something that our current model of the way the world works is no longer the best model.
Are you familiar with the work of Ian McGilchrist, who's been a previous guest on this, about the divided brain, by the way?
Oh, yes.
Yes. Because, funny enough, there's a question there. He believes there are 4 ways to the truth: science, reason, intuition, and imagination, fundamentally. Yeah. And it's very interesting. By the way, a lot of scientific progress proceeds, for example, through noticing anomalies.
Yes.
That actually the record of science in terms of what you might call hardcore data crunching has been remarkably unsuccessful, whereas if you look at everything from penicillin to Viagra, I would argue that Viagra was a marketing discovery. I don't think the scientists, because someone noticed the weird behavior of people in a trial who, when asked to return, they said, "This doesn't work against angina at all. Please, can you send your unused tablets back?" And the respondents went, "No!"
Yes.
And they simply said,
"You can wring them out of my cold, dead hands."
My cold, dead hands. And sensibly, someone said, "That's never happened before. Let's find out what's going on."
Yes. No, and so here's an interesting, like, the world of science to me is so fascinating. So, you think of the scientific method crudely as you have create a hypothesis, you have to design an experiment, run the experiment, and conclude whether your hypothesis is right or wrong. You can find in the world tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of PhD courses on how you design an experiment, how you analyze an experiment, whether or not you can conclude conclusively or not. Tens of thousands of courses on that. I have yet to find a course on how to create a novel hypothesis, which leads me to think that scientists don't know where babies come from. Right?
Yes.
Like, it's literally, and I know in the business field, I've looked long and hard across the world of business education, PhDs in business, and there is no course on how to generate hypotheses. And when I ask these scholars about how it is, well, they'll say things like, well, you should read the literature.
There isn't any literature?
Huh? Yeah, there isn't any literature about kind of a new idea that hasn't been thought of. So it's sort of, I think of it as the academic world as Tom Wolfian, right? The right stuff. It's like, how do you know somebody's successful a test pilot? How do you know? He's still alive, right?
They're still alive.
Right, yeah. You send them up. The ones that crash weren't, and the ones that don't are.
That's why they chose Neil Armstrong, wasn't it? I think he was just very good at landing that bedstead thing.
Yeah. So I guess I just think that we don't train anybody in this idea of how to create novel hypotheses. I think, and I'm accused of being too favorable toward design education. Patrick Whitney, my friend, says you think it's rose-colored glasses. He was the dean of the Institute of Design, but I think, at least in the field of design, if you go and take a degree in design, they just keep making you do projects where you need to come up with a novel hypothesis, essentially.
Of course.
And so you at least get practiced at it. What Patrick would say in response to me is, Roger, we need to be more rigorous about what we want them to actually do and think. We just put them through a whole bunch of tests, and they're like Tom Wolfe's pilots. They either land the plane, or they're a designer, or they don't land the plane and they're not.
I've got a lovely example, by the way, which is that Bucky is the fantastic Texas.
Yes. You showed them.
They basically reinvented the entire business. I learned last night.
Yes.
By having a hypothesis that it was nothing to do with the sale of gasoline.
Yes.
The success of a gas station was all to do with the endurance of the human bladder.
Yes.
And that the only way you could enjoy a competitive advantage in gasoline was to create a gas station so attractive that people were prepared to wait an extra 10 or 15 miles in order to go there. And this is absolutely true, because I actually feel sorry for the intervening gas stations in the 20 or 30 mile approach to places.
They're just annihilated.
By the way, one reliable finding from the past, which I think will be replicated in the future, is that whenever any business does something, and by the way, this is also true of ad agencies. We actually got some consultants in who looked at Ogilvy and said, you occasionally do amazing things, but do you realize this mostly happens when someone significantly deviates from the approved methodology? True of our clients. Famously, I suppose Tom Watson, when he created the IBM PC division, deliberately put it 500 miles from headquarters.
Yes.
Because he said, if you're anywhere near HQ. Nespresso only survived within Nestle because for 2 years they lied about their figures.
Yes, yes.
Okay. By the way, I recommend that approach to all of you. I think it's brilliant.
Uh-oh, she's coming.
If all this forecasting is rubbish, actually just lie about it.
Yeah.
Play, why not?
Play the rubbish game.
Play
the rubbish game, absolutely.
This is a joy. My one little thing, you're also a fan of TRIZ, that Soviet-era innovation methodology.
Yes.
Which is a guy called Gerald Eltzhuller. And when I first came across it, I thought, well, what's the Soviet Union got to teach about innovation? And then I realized that given the fact that it was an appalling culture for innovation, you had to be pretty good
to survive it.
And I suppose my contention is, I think there's a marketing equivalent of TRIZ. I think there's a kind of equivalent in psychology.
Yeah.
Sorry,
we could try to create that.
See, I get in trouble with Anna. He's not really in trouble with me. It's me.
We'll cut this through. But that's my final dream.
There is so much more.
I like the dream.
About.
A pleasure.
Roger,
Thank you very much.